if we want mid-century decarbonization of transport, sometime around 2030, 2040, all the vehicles need to be electrified.
Hello and welcome to the season 2 of Understanding the Future. I'm your host Punit Gandhi, and Climate Center for Cities is excited to bring to you a podcast about the future of work in the field of climate change, urban development, sustainability, and innovation. We will talk to experts working on ground as well as in the top management of government and non-governmental organizations to better understand how their field looks like in future. This will help us in preparing to enable climate actions as well as gauge the type of skill sets and jobs that would be required in future to solve complex challenges. If you are listening to it for the first time, do tune into season 1. Hello and welcome to the season 2 of Understanding the Future. I am your host Punit Gandhi, and today we have with us Vivek Chandran. He is Associate Director for the Transport Vertical at the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, and he will help us understand about the accessible urban transport. Welcome to the show, Vivek.
Thanks, Punit. Pleasure to be here.
Let's talk about urban transport and what do we exactly mean by accessible urban transport when we are referring to it?
Certainly. So accessibility refers to the idea of the ability of anybody, including goods to an extent, but maybe we can keep that separate. But it's the ability of anybody to reach a desired destination, right? And that is the idea of accessibility. Now, it manifests in many ways. There are certain factors that determine how accessible a certain area is. So it is location-centric, but it's also centered around the modes that people use to access those certain areas, right? So, for example, cost of transport is generally the factor that determines access is generally cost. And cost from a larger, broader way of thinking about it, it is either time that it takes to reach a certain place, or it is the monetary fare or cost that you pay to get there. Could also be thought of as the level of comfort or discomfort you face to reach a certain place or through a certain mode, right? A good example would be if you would take any form of transport, and public transport being a great case, that, for example, bus services are there in your city, but perhaps it's more than 2 or 3 kilometers away from you. That's the stop that is available to you. So you would then have to say that, okay, bus is not necessarily an accessible mode of transport to get to where you are, you want to go, or to get to where you are, where you live, right?
Yeah.
So from the public transport point of view, then maybe it's not very accessible. So instead, you would probably prefer to walk to where you want to go, or cycle, or use an Ola or an Uber, or any of these other modes of transport, right?
Yeah.
So that's the way we can look at the idea of accessibility.
That's quite concisely defined, and I do like it that you can look at it from goods as well as people perspective. So let's talk about the urban sector of it as well. What are some of now the underlying things happening on urban transportation systems? And so what is the current scenario we are looking at, and how is it transforming with time?
Sure. So some of the important transitions that we are looking at currently are what is known as the three revolutions. Actually, this was coined by UC Davis and ITDP in a report, perhaps 3 to 4 years ago. The idea is known as shared, connected, and electric, right? I think electric mobility is something we're all getting used to. So that's not an alien concept anymore. Shared mobility is something we've already gotten used to. So in terms of all of our abilities to use Ola and Uber and all of these newer app-based systems of transport is something that we've also gotten used to. I think what might be a concept that we're not very familiar with is the connected concept, right? Which is connected vehicles. And what occurs when vehicles are connected to each other, how they can optimize themselves. But let me step back and give you an idea of what has happened here. Essentially, it's three technologies that have matured outside of transport that has enabled this to happen, right?
Okay.
So we have information technology.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that has grown with the internet itself, right?
Yeah.
And how we are managing technology, how we have information in our hands at
Yeah.
every point we are moving around with our mobile phones and smartphones.
Yeah.
So that revolution has really enabled the shared mobility possibilities. And let me get into the shared mobility modes a little later as to how to define them, how they are changing and evolving. Similarly, battery technology on electric, right?
Yeah.
10 years ago, batteries costed almost 10 times as much as they used to today. And that reduction in cost has really made electric mobility possible. And there are a few more technologies that could perhaps take us to zero emission vehicles, but electric is the foremost runner, something that is practical today that we can adopt.
True.
And of course, the Internet of Things. Now, when we look at 5G, one of the important enablers, 5G is at least showing up on phones nowadays. And in terms of what cellular networks are talking about in terms of the next step. But what it really can enable is interaction, very high speed interfaces between vehicles and devices and that information can lead them to make decisions to an extent using AI perhaps, so that those could be optimization decisions, which route to take, which lane to change, what speed to be at. And the benefits of those are, of course, safety, time saved, emission saved, because you're traveling shorter distances. So that would be one way of looking at it. On the shared and electric bit, I want to probably spend more time, because that's perhaps what is immediate and more relevant to us, right? So on shared mobility, what really has happened is that the ability to exchange information over a device has made it possible for operators to realize what demand exists, where it exists, and then start optimizing for that purpose. So now cab services are a great example of that, right? There is now the ability for them to be shared among multiple people, right? Earlier, cab pooling of rides used to be the thing in the previous decade. And we've overcome them, and now it's a commercial activity, and it's a seamless activity that can be undertaken. Of course, COVID has put a spanner in all of those issues in terms of sharing and shared mobility. But I think that we will overcome those as time progresses. It has also evolved in terms of how public transport services can be looked at. So now even public transport operators are considering on-demand services. And that's a huge difference to the scheduled mechanisms with which buses were operated, right? So new models are evolving. And I think it's still a phase in which a lot more can be done, and a lot more is being done at this point.
I would just like to, something that caught me was on-demand public transport. Can you give a bit more example about that? I think that would be interesting.
So I think we are familiar with the Ola and Uber model, right? That we are able to hail a ride as soon as we would intend to access a service. And that is essentially what on-demand service is about. Of course, it was not possible earlier. Booking a ride meant perhaps calling someone up maybe an hour or two in advance. And that is to an extent how these services evolved early on as well. You needed to book your service much in advance. But now that there are many people on the providing that service, because the number of drivers have increased who are on these platforms, the platforms have gotten better at dealing with this information and figuring out who's close to you or when they would end a trip close to you, and then started optimizing how to allocate those trips to who. So again, there has been optimizations that have been done. And of course, online payment and interactions between people have also gotten far easier. So there's many smaller improvements in technology that have occurred that have made this a very seamless process.
Yeah.
Of course, when it comes to buses and bus transport, that hasn't been as simple a journey. One of it is because, and predominantly because, the policy environment hasn't really evolved at the speed at which technology has evolved. And you might have noticed this even in cab aggregators, that the rules for cab aggregators are oftentimes not there or are being evolved, and then some states run into trouble with them and some operators run into trouble for not meeting those standards, and there's a stiff between the state and the aggregator in this case. But again, I think policy is evolving, but if a more open policy environment can enable new and innovative ideas to evolve there.
Okay. I absolutely agree. And I like that, okay, yeah, we have already moved to a better shared economy in terms of transport system, at least now. In metro cities also, we see this quite often, that people are refraining to buy cars because of these things that are easily available, which is a big plus. So we will come back to that again. But before that, I want to ask this thing, that electric is now everywhere. Everyone is talking about electric. It is something that even government is pushing it, not in the private sector more than the public sector. So how do you see that sector evolving with time, and how do you see it increasing its penetration with time?
Yeah. So I think I would like to answer that question from a lot of what we're doing at Shakti and the work that we're looking at as well. Because this is really peering into the future that we're doing at some level. EVs and our work is centered around sustainable transport and sustainability, decarbonization of transport, right? And from that perspective, electric vehicles are certainly at the center of that conversation, because it has become almost the fundamental solution that would lead to transport decarbonization.
Yeah.
Of course, at the same time, there is the assumption that renewable energy on the grid side would continue to increase. And by 2030, the government has again ambitious targets there, and very certain targets there that they're trying to meet. And hopefully that journey continues by 2050. And we have a far greener electricity grid, phasing out some of the coal that we have. So assuming that the power sector is going to green, if we don't make this electric mobility shift now, we're going to be stuck with a bunch of internal combustion engine vehicles, ICE vehicles, that would take far many more years to phase out, because any of these vehicles, their life is anywhere between 10 to 20 years. Personal vehicles can be used, if they're used sparingly, can be used for very many more years, right? Commercial vehicles do wear out faster. But that means if we want mid-century decarbonization of transport, sometime around 2030, 2040, all the vehicles need to be electrified. But that's a good 20 years. If it took 10 years for battery prices to come by half, 20 years is a long time for a lot of innovation and a lot of change and a lot of progress to be made. So I don't doubt at all from the point of view of the technology that we are not already here. In fact, we are already here because many use cases have already been electrified and are cost competitive. And they're already being deployed, right? If not at scale, because there are multiple barriers that are keeping us from deploying at scale. We could perhaps talk about that later. But essentially, there are already use cases that are being electrified. And so I think the important challenge here is that battery prices there is this theoretical threshold of $100 per kilowatt hour. Right. So battery prices have they were $1,000 around 2010. They've come down to about $130 for one battery pack of a kilowatt hour. And it's expected to reach 100. It already hit 100 in some parts in certain applications in China for electric buses, especially because they're big, huge batteries. And they're expected to reach that in another 2 to 3 years, right? So 2023 is the time that it's expected to reach $100, And once that happens, that has been the critical threshold, which is imagined for most vehicle types to become practical. Most cost of ownership, not only ownership of the vehicle, but also the price, the sticker price of a vehicle, to become competitive enough and compelling enough for people to go and purchase it.
Yeah.
So that is really what will be the tipping point in this case for this technology. It needs a lot of policy push to help us get there, right? The 10-time decrease in battery prices have not happened in just because of technology. It has happened because many governments have pushed policies to deploy electric vehicles at high cost with high subsidies, but essentially given enough demand for that industry to deploy at scale. And that the more of that learning rate would actually eventually end up with a reduced cost. In India as well, we don't necessarily manufacture electric vehicle batteries. And the moment we start doing that, and we do that in large factories and in large numbers, the supply chains would fall in place, and those prices would definitely lower for us than if we were to import it, for example, right? So multiple aspects there that are making electric vehicles practical for us.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So for me, I have never really put it in that perspective that, okay, if you're looking at it from mid-century shift, how in next 10 years we can just shift to electric, and then next 20 years is where innovation can take place. And that's quite fascinating. But what about then new technologies like hydrogen? Because they are also creating quite a lot of buzz around here. And how will they kind of compete with this market segment?
So the challenge in hydrogen is a bit more because unlike electric vehicles where the technology is to a large extent proven, it's just about manufacturing at scale, deploying at scale, enabling charging infrastructure.
Yeah.
The situation with hydrogen is a little different because the technology itself requires a lot more in terms of it to mature enough to finally deploy. And of course, associated with any technology is the cost at which it can be deployed, right?
Yeah.
Which is why with electric, it was the $100 battery. With hydrogen, there is quite a way to go. There are shortcuts to it, but those shortcuts, unfortunately, are not the greenest ways of producing hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is actually produced for several applications in the country already. So, for example, industrial processes requiring hydrogen need hydrogen to be produced, and they produced mostly through gas, right? Natural gas.
Yeah.
Now, that's a fossil fuel, and so there's really no advantage if you're running around with hydrogen produced from fossil fuels because essentially you're just burning fossil fuel, right?
Yeah.
So there's really no advantage there. So hydrogen needs to then be produced through a process of electrolysis, which is the process of splitting water and getting hydrogen from that, right? And the idea there is solar power will be used because that's renewable energy. Solar power cannot be stored at this point, and this could be a really good manner in which excess solar power could be transitioned into a liquid fuel or a gas in this case that has more energy or could be transferred or used in some other application itself. And so that is the method with which hydrogen is expected to be used. But the challenge there is of cost and technology. And neither is this technology easily accessible because this is present in some countries. For example, Japan has pioneered this. And folks like companies like Toyota have been deploying money in terms of R&D for many years on this idea, and so they have an edge. But it's not as common as the lithium-ion battery, which now doesn't even have a patent. Actually, the technology is freely accessible, provided you can have the technical abilities to put it together properly. So these are the challenges to be overcome with hydrogen. But I think with time, perhaps hydrogen will be useful in some hard to electrify applications. So, for example, shipping could be something that could be electrified with hydrogen. So could aviation, and maybe even heavy vehicles such as trucks. Especially if they need to fly in a situation where charging infrastructure is not easily accessible, for example, right? So in those applications, there is definitely a use case for hydrogen that may appear. With India, cost becomes the issue, but in several other countries, it may not be the same case. There may be cost might not be as much of a concern, and so there may be a long way to go with hydrogen. That's the catch. So most predictions have it that 2030 to 2040 is the period in which hydrogen vehicles will start maturing. And perhaps 2040 onwards is when it would start penetrating in larger numbers.
Okay. And so this brings me back to the initial point that you had touched upon, was on the goods, and what is the accessibility of goods for the goods over here in transport sector. So how does that whole freight concept come into picture over here? Because that is again one of the biggest polluting factors for transportation as of now. So what is being thought around those lines?
You're absolutely right. Freight, when talking about decarbonizing transport, freight is the biggest challenge because it is almost 40% of current emissions from the transport sector. And because we are a developing country, because we are going to consume more, we will need to transport more goods around the country. And as a result, if my memory serves me right, we're expected to increase freight transport almost by 4 to 6 times by 2050 from 2010 levels.
Okay.
Right? And so that's a huge multiplier in terms of the amount of freight that is going to be moving around. And if we go about it in the same way that we have already using ICE vehicles, that means emissions will also increase by that many times. And that's just not possible. We just can't afford it from the climate point of view. So freight from that point can be split into two activities, and then both the solutions to decarbonizing them are easier in one, which is urban, and not as easy perhaps, or needs more effort and time on the long haul freight piece. The long haul is intercity, cross country kind of transport of goods that occur over trucks today.
Yeah.
So that is what needs a little bit more attention, because if you were to notice urban freight, a lot of it is already getting electrified with auto rickshaws that are carrying groceries now from go downs to houses, from with popular again app-based services, but also to shops and other places, right? So that's already starting to get electrified with good policies. More light vehicles can get electrified. So light commercial vehicles are essentially cars, or cars that are built with more storage instead. And so those can also get electrified. But trucking still needs some amount of work, because the challenge there is the batteries are not as energy dense as, for example, diesel or petrol, right? And so what it means is these trucks now need to carry many more batteries, and those batteries eat up into the truck's own load that it should have been carrying in any case. So that is the challenge. The way of solving this, at least theoretically, is to have batteries that are capable of being charged quickly, right? So there's a bit of a technological challenge there, but also the availability of fast and super fast chargers, right, on highways. And that can really help keep the cost down, because I mean there are other ideas of electrifying highways, but then that's just prohibitively expensive, because it's as good as deploying a rail network all over again, with all of the electricity grid and all of the infrastructure. And so that, rather than that, it's easier to kind of crack this from a technological point of view with better batteries, lighter batteries that have higher storage capacity, as well as charging infrastructure that can, meet those needs. So that's the challenge with electric trucks. And of course, like I said, I think urban freight can already, to a large extent, be electrified. So one of the important mechanisms to make this happen is to adopt use cases with HDVs, for example, that are already present. So if you look at ports, a port is a location where there's a lot of freight that's coming from a ship or from an aircraft or from a rail, right? And essentially the job of the truck is to take that load from the vehicle and then move it to a go down, right? And then just shuttle back and forth. And this go down is not going to be very far off, because it was essentially created around the port. So it'd probably be 10 miles, 20 miles, 30 miles at most, right? But then the job of the truck is just to keep shuttling up and down, and it knows where its point of pickup is. It knows where its point of location where it needs to drop off that freight is. So these points are fixed. All you need to do is provide good chargers there and run those trucks in those situations. So in fact, Tata Steel, if I'm not wrong, in Jamshedpur did electrify about 17 or 20 of its trucks now. I think the good thing is Tata has its own trucks. Truck company has and understands the need to electrify trucks. So with that motivation, we've gone ahead and done that. And with the exact idea, right? It's just steel that's being produced in the factory needs to be moved to perhaps a rail ahead where it'll be transported into another mode. And it just keeps going up and down. So with those kind of applications, one is you create demand. The other is we get comfortable with the technology. The industry learns from these pilots, and then we keep moving forward. And that's the hope that we all have.
That surely sounds like a good strategy to go forward as well, because this reminds me of one of the things back in Netherlands when I was studying there, and we saw with the port of Rotterdam that how they had automated the whole port service with just 3 people on board functioning the whole port, while that is the busiest port of Europe. So that is where your connected shared electric kind of systems do completely come in together, I feel. And
already come together in that sense, right?
Yes, exactly, which is fascinating to see. So let's come back to the urban side of it, and how can we support and enable decarbonization of transport and accelerate that in cities now?
Yeah, so as we've been discussing already, I think electric vehicles would be a very, very important mechanism to decarbonize transport. Technically, it's perhaps the only way it can be done because every other method can only reduce emissions and not eliminate emissions, right? Every other pathway gives us means to reduce demand. So whether it is move from personal vehicles to public transport, while from a developmental point of view, it has many, many co-benefits, many economic benefits. From the access point of view, it's perhaps the right thing to do from the point of view that we are not a rich country. We have many people who need access to transport to get to work. From that point of view, yes, public transport is an absolute necessity. But it doesn't eliminate emissions if it's not electric, right?
Yeah.
And so that becomes the challenge. So we can avoid a lot of emissions, but then for that the remaining emissions to go, it has to have been electric, and that is the challenge for us from the point of view of the work that we do, because it is a new technology. It needs policy support, and that is really where the challenge is for us. The railways is actually a very interesting alternative as well. And this is actually digressing from the urban question. I realize you asked the question about urban, but the railways can be quite interesting because the railways is already electrified or is electrifying in a big way. And all that, any freight or any passenger mobility on it is essentially clean, provided we're getting the power from clean sources. And even DMRC has a big push towards deploying solar power in its operations. And so if that takes on that increases, we're actually going to see a lot more of clean transport options, including rail and road at the same time.
No, absolutely. I agree with you that we already have certain kind of systems in place where a lot of things are already electric, at least intrastate or intercity kind of thing as well. And I do hope that with more and more now the delivery apps also coming into picture and trying to shift towards the electric mobility in general might lead this way towards a cleaner transportation. So next up, I want to again come back to the connected part of it. And you have mentioned that how IoT is one thing, and 5G services will help cities, will help transportation in just better managing them. So what are some of the new technologies or innovations we can kind of look into that sector as of now, or should expect to come in the future?
So the question on IoT with India is actually a tricky one, because if I'm not wrong, we have a formal policy of not encouraging autonomous vehicles. It doesn't stop innovation though.
Yeah.
But I think we are still quite a distance from enabling autonomous vehicles. So if you look at Tesla, it already has its own methods, at least assistance that it provides to drivers, right? Using the sensors that it has, the cameras that it has, and onboard intelligence that it has to respond to whatever, let's say, barriers or changes to the environment that it sees. Has avoided many accidents, recorded that it's much safer than not have had those assistance, but it's still not at the point where we're saying it's fully autonomous, right? At the same time, if our streets are not necessarily designed to be autonomous, we have a very mixed use streets, right? In terms of the multiple modes that we have in India, the multiple modes of transport are also of different speeds and different, sometimes of different intelligence levels as well. I mean, they're not all smart, right? And so perhaps maybe in a highway, trying to autonomize vehicles might be a different challenge. And doing that in an urban area may be a very different challenge, right? So we may be some distance between getting fully autonomous vehicles or using a fully autonomous system. Let's put it that way. There may be some abilities that it gives us to make the system safer, avoid collision. With those hive systems, there's also optimization that can be done with chaining of vehicles one behind the other. So there's a lot of efficiencies that can be gained by that. But I'm skeptical that in India we're going to have that anytime soon, although the technology may be there.
Fair enough. So coming to one of the last questions that we generally ask everyone is on lines of what kind of skill sets do you feel are important to work in the field of urban transport or to develop accessible urban transport? What all different kinds of skill sets we would require?
All right. For accessible urban transport, or would you rather use maybe look at it from the point of view of sustainable urban transport? Let's look at it from a larger, broader, because all of these transitions that we are talking about to an extent then come into the picture. I think from the point of view, we did discuss the fact that technology and IT has had an important role to play in the transformation of transport itself, right? From enabling aggregators, cab aggregators, to enabling bicycle sharing at the smallest level. All of this has happened because of technology. And so I do see that we might, and this has been the case in most industries, that we will see more of those skills being deployed for applications of transport, right? I don't think it takes away the job of a transport planner. I don't think it takes away the job of policymakers who still need to look at what is the economic good that we are trying to create, right? And what is the how is it increasing economic efficiencies? So those challenges continue to exist, and those problems need to be addressed. But here is another tool to address that problem, right? It makes the task easier. It makes accessing information easier. And so from that point of view, I think IT is a great enabler. On the electric mobility transition, I think the ICE industry, the internal combustion industry, is going to see a huge transformation as a result of this, right? We are moving away from an engine which has thousands of moving parts, and essentially as a result has thousands of more people working on it because these are smaller parts and need to all come together in complex ways. But we're going to a simpler system and a system that doesn't have an engine. It essentially has a motor and has a battery instead, right? Far lesser moving parts. As a result, far more savings in money. That's the USP of electric vehicles. But there is definitely a transformation that is happening from the technology front. And this means we are moving more from the mechanical aspects to some of the electronics, and the electrical aspects are going to increase in vehicles. So making motors, making batteries are different kinds of jobs that would be created. Power electronics is an industry that would have a huge push from what is inside a vehicle for charging infrastructure to what is outside the vehicle in terms of chargers itself. All of them would need power electronics. So that's a different aspect altogether. So I see, there's a bunch of new jobs that are being created as a result of these transition. But I think there has been I would also address this issue that there's been some skepticism that, these are all going to take away jobs of existing people. And I think that need not really be there. because this is a transition that you're talking about, and the transition takes time, and the transition can be, with good policies, it can be designed well enough that it is not disruptive, it is not sudden, it is not taking people by surprise. There's enough time to reskill, upskill people who are in current jobs. It in fact even opens up jobs for newer sets of people, communities of people. For example, women are now picking up driving because these are not as complex vehicles as they used to be. This doesn't take, mechanical strength to understand. These are far simpler vehicles, and so that's an advantage as well. So I think we're getting to a space where this is a bit more inclusive, and as a result, involving more people and taking more people along. The good side about EVs is also that there's an extension to this industry, because the RE industry also gets kicked in, because we're talking about decarbonizing through renewable energy and solar energy. And there's tons of jobs to be created there as well, in terms of deploying solar cells and solar parks that need to be created at scale. So all of those are job intensive kind of work that's to be undertaken in the future. So there's essentially more jobs there that will be created as a result of this transition itself.
I do agree with you with it, that while there is a lot of jobs that will go out because of the change in industry, but that will always end up opening more doors somewhere or the other. So while we will have to plan how the transition happens in a better way, but I think this is still a feasible thing to do, then not to change systems as required. Thank you so much. And if I have missed out of any point that you would like to cover, please do so while considering this topic.
No, I think we've touched upon most aspects. Yeah, nothing much I would like to share at this point, at least.
Okay. Thank you so much, Vivek. This was surely a very interesting conversation to have and understand in better context what is accessible urban transport, not just from people's point of view, but also from goods point of view. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Puneet. It was my pleasure.
You have been listening to Understanding the Future podcast. To know more about Climate Center for Cities, check out our website www.niua.org/c-cube. The show is conceptualized, produced and edited by Punit Gandhi, Senior Associate at CQ. You can now subscribe to our podcast on your favorite channel, which can be accessed through the credits. Also, don't forget to follow us on our social media for more updates. Do share your reviews with us and help us spread the podcast to your friends and colleagues. Do write to us if you would be interested in learning about any specific topics. Thank you and stay tuned for our next episode.